protection order? Oh, a protection order. A restraining order. That's what I was looking for. God.
Hey everyone, welcome to Connecting the Dots. My name is Ignacio, and I'm here with
Alisa Zipursky.
Tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I'm the founder of HealingHonestly.com, a website where I write about what it means to be a young person healing from childhood sexual abuse and living with trauma in their lives.
Yeah, she is awesome. If you have not read her blog, please do so. She has a lot of great information out there, and she's also a dear friend of mine. So I'm really happy that you're here to contribute to this film. And I'm so happy that you chose this because I'm thinking about what's a good movie, book, or anything to talk about, to connect to preventing childhood sexual abuse, or why we talk about ending sexual violence. And so you chose the movie Enough. I forget what year that.
Starring the iconic Jennifer Lopez.
Jennifer Lopez, J-Lo. And I think it was in 2002, maybe. I'm not sure. But it came out a while ago. And for those who have not seen it, please do see it, and then you can come watch this kind of analysis that we're doing. But Enough is about a woman who falls in love with this guy who is really pretty amazing in the beginning. And then they get married. And then this man becomes a person who controls every aspect of her being. And she's pretty much a prisoner. She has a child, and she quickly realizes that this is not where she wants to be. He's getting violent. You want to pick it up there so we can
So he's like controlling and abusive, and we see that pretty early on in their marriage, and then it becomes violent, and it seems like really quickly she realizes like this is a very untenable situation, and she tries to remove herself and her daughter from the husband who is so abusive. And he like hires hitmen, he like has all this money, and he like uses it to try to like hunt her down no matter where she goes, harass anybody who's in her life, really with the ultimate goal, he does intend to kill her. And she consults a lawyer who basically tells her, because she never went to the police, because she left out of state in all these different ways, that like there is no real recourse for her legally to have full custody of her daughter, and that in fact in showing up to the pending custody battle, her husband will just use it as an opportunity to now know where she is and hunt her down and kill her. Feeling like she has no other options, she is bankrolled by an estranged father of hers to have a month where she does this like very intensive, amazing training montage scene where she trains herself to learn how to kill him. And then we have the epic final really like battle scene where she goes into his home applying all of her training and kills him. And that is like truly the end of the movie. Like she's reunited with her daughter, and then that's like it. That's really our crux of the movie.
Happy ending, right? That's the way it's like.
It's a feel-good film. Like any rom-com. No. I was like, it had been a while since I watched it. I watched it when I was young a couple times, but then probably I hadn't seen it as an adult. So it had probably been like, I don't know, 15 years at least since I had seen it. And then at the end, I was like, oh shit, like it really does just end. Like she murders him, she sees her daughter, and then like that's it. Yeah. Yeah,
so it's like, it is this kind of revenge movie, this like revenge fantasy, right? And so this is something that I am sure many survivors kind of get into that headspace or that fantasy sometimes that you want to get revenge. If you were able to get revenge, you would so and so and so and so. And I know in my writing, I did a lot of just like wanting to punch and just grab, like really physically hurt this person and just harm them. And I knew that it wouldn't happen, but thinking about it, writing about it felt so good. But you can't really talk about those things. It's hard to talk about your ideas of revenge. Sometimes unless it's in the criminal justice system. I mean, often people say, I would kill that, motherfucker, I would do this. But most times that's not what they're going to do, right? It's a lot of anger. But to see this movie um, uh, be portrayed like this almost heroic thing, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
don't get me wrong, I think the fantasy is fucking awesome. And I also believe in um, protecting yourself. And if death is a result of protecting yourself, yeah. But I wonder about the underlying message around revenge. Not fantasy, because fantasies are okay, but the
Yeah,
actual applicationism within this movie, right?
absolutely. So I'm totally with you about this really interesting question of like, where is the line between revenge fantasy and like making a popular film about revenge? And is it revenge or is it self-protection? And for me, I remember watching that as a kid and thinking it was like super badass. And then many years later, as an adult, when I was going through a really, really difficult time in my healing, I thought back to that movie and I thought it would be cool if I learned how to box. And I actually trained as a boxer for about 4 years. And it was incredibly helpful in my healing and like in the somatic way of feeling like powerful and in control of my body. And yet I always knew that I would never have a physical experience with the person who harmed me. But that did absolutely fuel my desire to continue to train. I think in part to just feel more in control in my body and more powerful in my body. And that in and of itself can be something that is super healing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I agree. I mean, that motivates you to do something that feels good, then yes. But with the understanding that you wouldn't use that, although that could be used in other instances when needed, if ever needed. I'm also thinking about this in like, I'm always thinking about how we replicate violence, right? And even in we have the best intentions, like maybe in this film, it was about really showing that with all the odds stacked against her, that this woman was not going
Mm-hmm.
to let this, happen to her.
Mm-hmm.
She did it, she did it and she got rid of the problem because it was the only way, right?
Yeah.
But the problem, I think, many problems are that the problem is that number one, the reality is that women or individuals who are in domestic violence or intimate partner violence situations who end up killing their wrongdoers end up in prison. They end up in prison, and it's not this story that you get to train, kill somebody, and then cover your tracks, and you have all these people helping you, and all that. That is the opposite of what happens, right? And so it is a story, so I don't think it's not one that can't be told, but positioning it next to the stories of um, basically women being murdered or women going to prison all the time, um, it tells a false narrative of um, power. I think the specific kind of power, you
I
know.
couldn't agree more with you. And I found myself thinking over and over again about the Survived and Punished project
Mhm.
while I was watching, which amplifies the stories of survivors who are incarcerated in large part because they have acted in self-defense. And then were incarcerated as a result of that, and incarcerated because of they figured out how to literally stay alive, and survive, and also like protect their families. And so I kept thinking about that as sort of the counterbalance to like this heroic sort of arc that we get to watch Jennifer Lopez's character go through. And the other thing that I found really striking about the movie, in thinking about it in the lens of like these larger conversations that we're having about accountability and what that looks like, with people who commit harm, is like the husband in this movie is just like a straight up monster. Like, yes, we find him like charming and interesting in the beginning, but once he starts being abusive, it is really like a non-linear journey for him. Like, he starts being a monster and then he just like straight up is a monster. And I know it's a movie and we have like a story to tell, but I kept thinking like, that's just not how it works, you know, both in terms of like the person who's harming you is monstrous, but also they're human, and also they often do things that are also good, that makes it even more complicated and more confusing and more difficult to even enjoy a revenge fantasy, because you're thinking about them as a complicated full human. But then also, you know, it makes it so much easier to feel like gratified by the ending of her killing him, because we actually don't really see any humanity in him.
Right.
And that's just like not how shit works, especially when we're being harmed by somebody who is like in our family.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and I know that people will argue different people experience that person in different ways. And yeah, so we get to experience people and they're not one dimensional, right? And that's not what we often hear when we are at the end of receiving that. Because, you know, sometimes I'm like, when people ask me about my harm doer, I'm like, I don't give a fuck, you know, but it's like, I understand the questions. And in that moment, that is my reaction to something. But in the larger scheme of things, I don't want to be a part of a system that continues to replicate violence, or to have it in other ways, whether it's like this heroic way, whether it's through like being put to death on, you know, death row because the state did it. I talked about it in the last Connecting the Dots, when sometimes when we have rapists and child predators who go to prison, lots of times people, one of the common things that people say is, I hope that person gets raped and I hope that they get the same thing that they did, right? And I understand that rage. God, I understand that rage, that you just want somebody to suffer the way that you
Yeah.
That is absolutely understandable. And at the same time, when you think about that in a larger scheme of things, it's like you are actually wishing, I think, one of the most violent acts onto another human being, and that takes away your humanity, right? And you're also not thinking about the person inflicting the rape. That's another whole person in this scenario that we're not thinking about. It's just a thing that grows and grows. So it's hard to, you know, pick and point. It's a huge, it's a whole system that we need to like look at. And when we pick and say this person is a monster and should be, you know, that it's okay that he was murdered, we're actually saying that we have this kind of rubric for who should be murdered and who shouldn't be, and we're doing something that the state, right? And then what do we believe in? Do we believe in what is a quick solution to that pain? And then what is do we think in terms of like the long game of how we deal with such horrific things, that monstrous things that people do?
I'm so with you on that. And I think that, I mean, I believe that there is a really important role that revenge fantasies can play in our healing. And I think that like, I don't know that we create enough space for that. Because if we can really understand that revenge fantasies can help us complete a cycle in our own mind of trauma that help us to address like the anger and the lack of power that we feel,
Yes.
that can help us create space to have conversations about what we want real accountability to look like. But I think if we don't have our own space to talk about what our revenge fantasies are, then that bleeds into the conversations around accountability, because all that anger and all that feeling of remembering what it's like to feel so powerless, it still lives in us
Mm-hmm.
if we don't almost like nurture that part of it. And so for me, I found revenge fantasies really difficult because for a long time, because I saw the humanity in the person that harmed me. And I thought because I saw the humanity in him, that meant that I couldn't hold him accountable for what he had done to me.
Okay.
That I thought because I saw the ways that he had been victimized in his own life, because I felt sorry for him in a lot of ways, that somehow invalidated the harm that he did to me. And that meant that, like, oh, he couldn't have really abused me because I can see all of these ways that he's human. And that stopped me from being able to really embrace the revenge that I had in me. That was living in there, but I kept like silencing it. And I really credit the leadership of so many people, including you in the transformative justice movement, for really helping me to understand that, like, seeing the humanity in somebody who's harmed you is not an invalidation of that abuse. Like, that is being alive, and that's being a person, you know? And that helped me to let myself tap into my anger and to let myself be angry. And once I realized that revenge fantasies were fantasies, like, game changer. I thought because when I thought about it, you know, something really terrible happening to him, that I like, that the end of the sentence was like, well, I like don't actually want that to happen to him. That then, like, there was no role for the revenge at all, because I didn't want the fantasy to happen. That meant the fantasy was irrelevant.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, no, bitch, that's a fantasy.
Exactly.
The whole fucking thing about it being a fantasy is that you don't actually want to act on it. It is like, it cognitively fulfills something that is like deep inside of us, you know? And so I thought, because I didn't want my fantasy to be an actual plan of action, that it was wrong. And now I'm like, oh no, I can like totally fantasize about all these terrible things happening to him. And like, that's okay, you know, because that actually doesn't, it's not in conflict with the accountability I desire.
Right, right. Yes. And I think about it too as like the thing that we're afraid to talk about, talking about the revenge fantasy. And I also think about how people are afraid to talk about suicide. But being on working on a suicide prevention line way back in the day, you learn that you don't shy away from the conversation of suicide. When somebody says, I want to kill myself, you engage and you're like, well, tell me about that. What's your plan? How are you thinking about doing it? You engage because you see where they're, what is going on. Are they on top of a roof about to jump, or are they in their bed depressed, needing to reach out and saying that this is what they feel is going to happen, right? Sometimes some people just need to talk about things, right? And so I feel like with that, it's a release of just saying, I need to talk about this. This is what it feels like in my body, and I just need to release, whether I'm writing it, whether I'm like dancing it out, whether I am saying it, cursing it, putting it in a poem. That was my shit. Like doing all of that, that helps with releasing, and it's okay to say those things. Wow.
Totally. And I think that, for me, the movie makes sense to me as a revenge fantasy.
Yeah.
It doesn't hold up to me as anything else. It doesn't quite make sense to me, but I feel like there's enough space in this world to like be able to enjoy revenge fantasies, and sort of watching that happen is really helpful. I found it really helpful. I don't know if you ever watched Westworld on HBO, but there's a character named Dolores, and we watched her be like sexually assaulted 1 million times over, and then she's a robot or like AI, and then she becomes like self-aware, and she goes on like a revenge terror. And it gets like a little out of hand, but like early on I was like, hell yeah, like, let's do this. Like, I was so, and it's like, I mean, we ultimately are supposed to see her as actually a villain because she takes it like too far. But like for a while, I was like, you know what? This is what I need. Like, I think it can be helpful to watch other people's revenge fantasies. It helps us tap into that for ourselves because, like, for me, it can feel so complicated because I was harmed by a parent and I have a lot of complicated feelings about them. And it's not this black and white thing for me. Like, it can be more difficult for me to tap into my revenge. But then when I like watch it on TV and it's someone else, I can be like, yes, let's go, let's do this, and I can get into it actually more easily because it's like depersonalized from the like really complicated shit that lives in me about the person who harmed me.
Absolutely. And also, I'm thinking about the movie. It's a movie, of course, and that I would totally accept it as revenge fantasy. I think it's great as revenge fantasy. She was, um, and I'm thinking about again all of the people that are in prison right now because of protecting themselves, and like this. So Jennifer Lopez, she gets played as an ambiguous character. So in this movie, she's not. I don't think she's ever even referred to as a Latinx person or anything. She usually plays ambiguously or white, right? So I think that's also this dynamic in the film too, right? Because when you engage race and then lack of education, when class, all of that, poverty, all of these things, it changes that and the resources that somebody has. Even though this guy was relentless. She got some resources and was able to, get out.
Totally.
Um, and I
We
would.
don't all like an estranged father who happened to have been on the cover of Forbes who decides all of a sudden that he's sympathetic to our plight and is going to bankroll us, which is the storyline.
Exactly.
Like, not a super common thing that happens.
That's what makes it a fantasy, right? Because it's like, wow, we got the money, we got the means to do this. And so, yeah, thinking about all the other intersections that are at play, which usually ends people right in prison, uh, wasn't touched on there at anything at race. I think it played exactly the way it wanted to play. There was this kind of domestic violence, stalking, obsessive, controlling man. A lot of things rolled into one. Had a lot of power. White. All of these things, and how he overcame that. It was far removed from a lot of reality, which probably, like you said, made it a lot better to digest and see the power in that. Yeah. So I think
I
it
will.
Mark for doing that really well.
The other thing I would say that it did well, I would say well for 2002.
Yeah.
So, in context, well for 2002, that the police state is not a viable option for many survivors for a plethora of reasons. Like, it does communicate that. Yeah. Because at no point they really quickly answer why that is not a avenue that is viable for our hero.
Yes. When we first talked about this movie, I immediately thought of The Burning Bed, and that was with Farrah Fawcett. The gist of the movie is that she was just severely abused by this, and basically, and I think this is based on the true story. She one day took the kids, put them in the car. I think he was drunk. She poured gasoline on him while he was sleeping on the bed on fire, and left. That was that. And it was like a huge film because I do believe it was a true story, if I'm not mistaken. And and I'm trying to remember back then when I saw it, why was it so huge? Was it huge because she burned him alive, and it was like, yeah, good for you? Or I know there were more discussions about the like domestic violence within marriages and how that is so invisible. Um, so I'm wondering what the deeper conversation was there. Was that about the revenge, right? But that revenge didn't get anywhere because she ended up right in prison where she shouldn't have been. She should have been getting help. She should have been getting help because she
So
had,
she did end up in prison for it,
yeah.
which is unfortunately a very realistic end to the story.
Mhm.
And I think it also brings up the question that you had brought up earlier, which is like, at what point are these stories of revenge and what point are these stories of self-preservation?
Mhm.
Jennifer Lopez, as she's preparing, she's broken into his house and she's preparing for his arrival and she's preparing for the final battle, and she's losing a little bit of nerve, and she picks up the phone and she calls Juliette Lewis and she says, "Tell it to me again, tell it to me again." And the line is something like, "You have a like God-given natural instinct, and right to protect yourself and your family." And that's like her fighting words that give her the courage to move forward in her plan. And so it is also sort of this question of like, is it revenge, or is this the only option that we are giving survivors? Is risking incarceration, when the other option is that like they're murdered.
Yeah.
By people who are harming them, and I think that this movie like makes that very clear, that was, if she had not intervened in this way, like that was the natural conclusion, the natural end of the story. Now, at no point does she try to access any sort of survivor resources, right? She mentions once that like she doesn't want to bring her daughter to a shelter, but that's it. There's no sort of her engaging with any sort of advocacy. And I wondered that. I was like, that would be like an unsexy part of the story. And like, she does go to the cops and hear her options, and they're like, this is how a restraining order works. And she's like, cool, he's definitely going to kill me anyway. So I totally agree with you about this, like really, that it can be this ethnically ambiguous, red as white woman narrative, and yet we know that for survivors who are not white women in positions of power, that's just not how their story is going to go.
The same way that I talk about sex in movies, and if we're talking about revenge fantasies or revenge, if we see them for what they are, or I should say pornography, if we see them for what they are, they wouldn't be a problem, right? Of a big of a problem. But that would mean that we would be talking about these things more explicitly, right? So this is all fantasy right here. This is entertainment, sexual entertainment and stuff. If you want to know the real stuff, this is how it happens really. Oh, this is a movie about revenge fantasies. These are things that people would love to do sometimes.
Like, giving us a like realistic portrayal of this is a completely different project.
Yeah.
It is a different project that has a purpose. Its purpose is not to fulfill this revenge fantasy entertainment for those of us who need that. And I was looking at all these white men, and it's like, you have no idea what this means to the rest of us. Like, yes, your kind is vilified in this movie and then murdered. And you're telling me that you didn't find it fun and entertaining for you. Like, fine, but like that's not what that's about, So I also found that very interesting. I wonder when they were making this movie whether they knew that it would fulfill this kind of, have this sort of cult love among so many of us who have experienced harm. But it's like, hell, it can't be this great.
I've never been to, but now I really, really want to experience going to a rage room. Have you heard of these things?
No, tell me everything.
I heard, don't know all the details, but there are places where you can go, and it's like have junk. things, like things from a
Oh,
junkyard.
and you put on the hard hat.
You could just break shit. You could just fucking break shit. Oh, I'm like, that is therapy. That is great. I think I want to experience that one day.
I have to tell you, the only reason I know about it is because quite often they portray them on the Real Housewives. It's like a group outing, and they put on the hard hats and the sledgehammer, and they go. But I love it, you know, like what I got from boxing,
Hmm.
um, really offered me a space for my revenge, but it and like that part of me, but it also, um, in a different way, it also offered me discipline around that. It you know, like punching the hell out of bags or out of, you know, somebody's mitts, like it gives you like such a release, and you are able to like exhaust the anger out of you. But then the fact that then you have to keep going
Right.
really offers a, for me, was offered a lesson in how to discipline my anger, how to use it in a way and harness it in a way that felt helpful and productive. And while it hasn't been available to me thanks to COVID for quite some time, those lessons are still there, you know, and that power doesn't go away.
Hmm.
Like, it is really something to just be in your body and let fury take
And
over.
I'm actually thinking about like the ways in I work through my rage, and that's through BDSM. That's where I work the rage and the pain. Um, that really works for me, and it works really well because and then it's in this consensual way where we've agreed on whatever the scenario is going to be, and I get to either relinquish or exert, and I love that. That's my space. That's my medicine, my healing right there. When I need to fucking cry until like boogers are coming out of my freaking nose. That's where I want to be. Like that's the place that's gonna take me there in a safe way. Or when I want to feel powerful, that I am fucking like growling like an animal, and
Yes.
I love that feeling. Fucking love. Every muscle in my body is pulsing, and I'm like, oh.
Yes. Yes.
And that's the
Until there's nothing, like until you have no option but collapse.
Mhm.
Because
Exactly.
there's nothing left in you that's fighting against you. Like
Exactly.
it's all out. And I think like doing that, like BDSM is such a wonderful example because it has so many boundaries and parameters, you know, and like discipline around it, you know, and it's like exercising that in a space where there are boundaries, where there are parameters, like allows for so much freedom. Because
Yes.
then, you know, as long as you're operating within the four corners of this sort of agreed upon, you know, understanding, then you can just like fucking go ham, which is like how I felt boxing too. I was like, okay, I know how to do this so that I'm not going to cause myself injury, right? How to like be respectful of the other people around me. And then now I get to go ham. I get to go as hard as I can, as hard as I want, for as long as I want, you know? And there's so much freedom in that.
Hmm. Yes. I'm gonna give a shout out to Impact Boston. They do defense courses and they're doing it online, and I know they have a lot of great courses. I think they might have one for um, all queers. They do rounds all the time, and they do great work. They do a lot of workshops, and the self-defense stuff is like very key. And I think I used to take self-defense when my daughter was younger. But the thing with self-defense courses is like it's something that you got to stay present with. For me, doing it once, I didn't feel still confident. Later on, I needed to like continue going and feeling more confident in my body. So I felt like I needed to do more work around that. But maybe that wasn't my avenue. Maybe it was BDSM. You see, I found BDSM.
Question that might be like a very, that I think it's coming from me also, from a space of like privileged white ladiness. Um, is like something I've always wondered about, something that is specifically self-defense. Like I was boxing, that's obviously like sort of a part of self-defense, but it wasn't like called that, you know what I mean? That with self-defense, is there ever this feeling in sort of engaging in something that's explicitly self-defense that it is conflating, that it is like your responsibility to like, is there ever a feeling that it leads to victim blaming?
I think that I think the self-defense courses that are out there, the ones that have been created, especially way back in the day, like women's self-defense in Brooklyn, where I used to go, I think they're really grounded in some values that are empowerment, and I think self-defense was the pull for a lot of people. It's like come be empowered, but through those classes, I think
Yeah.
more was being built in those, and that's the experience that I have had with
Yeah.
different.
That's wonderful.
But it's continuous, and it's an activity, it's a thing, it's a skill that you can learn, but it also is an avenue for a more deeper conversation, because sometimes people don't want to talk about the thing, right? But once you're there and you're meeting other people and you're engaging, people get to talk about why they're there, why they decided to take self-defense course. Things come out and you get to form community.
That's such a good point, because it's like working with the body, and the body as an avenue to access other parts of ourselves that don't feel as accessible is such a awesome, wonderful option for so many of us. Like when like for like a support group doesn't feel accessible to us because we don't access our trauma in like a narrative, particularly verbal way, maybe, like accessing it through a shared like physical experience, that makes so much sense to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those were the spaces where I got to feel comfortable and like talking, because so I love those when they have that framework, that feminist framework, that skills building, community based, grassroots. It's a
And it
really
sounds like what you're describing is like truly trauma informed.
yeah.
My impression was like from things that I see on TV, where it's like some man talking to women
Okay.
about like, you're a tiger cubs and you like this, you do this, and I'm like, cool, bro. Like, are you implying that like that like these women should be expected? You know what I mean? Like, if they fail to do that, that's somehow like that's their fault. But that is also television, and again connects us to the fact that TV and movies are not real life.
And this is why we wanted to do connect the dots, right? To have a space, because people do this anyway. We all dissect films and movies and stuff like that. And I was like, hey, why don't we do this live? I mean, why don't we do this, on camera so that we can share? So I want to pose something out to folks. I would love to hear what your revenge fantasies have been, right? If you are interested in sharing your revenge fantasies, go to our website, check it out, send us some revenge fantasies. We might share them, right? And tell us what you think about connecting the dots. And if you have a documentary, a film, a book, something that you feel that we should be examining on the show, please let us know. All right. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you. Love you.
Love you.